At 60, Evelyn had come to terms with a life of solitude. Widowed for over a decade, she resided in her house on the outskirts of a quiet suburban neighborhood. What was once a bustling community had grown more subdued with time, as most of her neighbors had either moved away or passed on. It wasn't until recently that the house next door was sold to a young man, Ethan, in his early 30s. He was charismatic and full of energy, a stark contrast to the peacefulness Evelyn had become accustomed to. She often saw him working in his garden or bringing groceries into his home, his youthful vigor a reminder of the vibrancy she once had. One bright afternoon, as Evelyn sat on her porch, Ethan waved at her from across the fence. Surprised by his friendly gesture, she waved back. That simple exchange marked the start of what would become a complex and intense connection. Over the following weeks, their interactions grew more frequent. Ethan would stop by to chat whenever he saw her outside, and Evelyn began to look forward to these moments. Though she didn't admit it to herself at first, she hadn't realized how lonely she had become until his attention filled a void she hadn't known existed. Evelyn's life had revolved around routine: books, gardening, and visits from her grown children, who were busy with their own families. But Ethan was different. He had a zest for life that reminded her of her younger self, carefree, spontaneous, and full of hope. She hadn't realized how starved she was for conversation and affection. Slowly, she found herself eagerly anticipating his visits, their discussions evolving from casual pleasantries to more personal subjects. Ethan would talk about his work, his travels, and his experiences. Evelyn, in turn, began reminiscing about her youth, the days when she had dreams beyond her roles as a wife and mother. What started as friendly exchanges gradually became more intimate. One day, as Ethan leaned over the fence to hand her some fresh tomatoes he'd grown, their hands brushed. Evelyn felt a spark, something she hadn't felt in years. Her heart raced, and for the first time in a long while, she felt alive. She quickly pulled her hand back, embarrassed, but Ethan smiled warmly, seemingly unaware of the emotions he had stirred within her. In the weeks that followed, their conversations became more frequent and intimate. Ethan often complimented Evelyn on her garden, praising her impressive green thumb. Evelyn was flattered, and her pride in her gardening skills gave her a sense of self-worth that had been missing for so long. One evening, Ethan invited her to his home for dinner. He had recently redecorated and was eager to show it off. Evelyn, initially hesitant, accepted. She felt nervous, unsure if this was a simple act of kindness or something more. The evening started innocently with small talk and a delicious meal. However, as the night wore on, Evelyn began to sense a growing tension. Ethan's compliments became more personal, and his gaze lingered on her a little too long. She noticed how he watched her lips as she spoke, how he laughed a little too loudly at her jokes. Evelyn tried to brush it off, telling herself he was just being polite, but deep down, she couldn't ignore the subtle flirtation that had begun to color their interactions. By the end of the evening, as Ethan walked her back to her house, he leaned in close, his voice soft and playful. "You look stunning tonight, Evelyn," he said, his eyes twinkling. Evelyn felt a warmth rise in her cheeks, and she smiled awkwardly, unsure how to respond. The flirtation, once subtle, was now unmistakable. She returned to her house, her heart pounding, her mind racing with confusion. Was this just harmless fun? Or was there something more? As the weeks passed, Evelyn found herself increasingly drawn to Ethan. He continued to show her affection, complimenting her appearance, intelligence, and warmth. It was a stark contrast to the coldness she had experienced in her marriage before her husband's death. She hadn't realized how starved she had been for the touch of a man until Ethan's flirtations began to awaken emotions she had long suppressed. One afternoon, Ethan invited her to take a walk with him in the park. As they strolled along the path, their conversation flowed effortlessly, and Evelyn found herself laughing more than she had in years. It felt effortless, comfortable, until Ethan halted and turned to face her, his gaze fixed firmly on hers, intense and unwavering. Before she could respond, he reached out and lightly touched her arm. The brief contact sent a shiver through her. Ethan leaned closer, his lips grazing her cheek in a soft kiss. Evelyn froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to pull away, but something inside her held her still. For the first time in years, she felt wanted. The kiss wasn't an expression of love, but rather an acknowledgement of desire, of longing. Ethan stepped back, his face flushed, but there was no regret in his eyes. Instead, he flashed a mischievous smile. "I've wanted to do that for a long time," he confessed. Evelyn was speechless, unsure of how to react or what to feel. But in that moment, part of her didn't want to stop him. She was no longer the cautious, reserved woman she once was. For the first time in ages, she felt alive, desired. And though she tried to resist, a part of her craved more. As their playful teasing deepened, Evelyn found herself swept up in a whirlwind of emotions. She knew what was happening was wrong. Ethan was young enough to be her son, and their bond went beyond friendship. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on her. Her children would never understand, and her reputation in the community could be destroyed if the truth came out. Yet, Evelyn couldn't ignore the yearning building within her. She began to crave Ethan's touch, the way he made her feel alive again. One evening, after a private dinner at Ethan's house, Evelyn sat on the couch, her heart racing. Ethan had been tender with her, his touch gentle but insistent. He kissed her again, this time on the lips. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She hesitated for a moment, but then she kissed him back, wrapping her arms around his neck. The kiss deepened, and soon they were lying together on the couch, the passion between them undeniable. Afterward, Evelyn lay in his arms, her mind a swirl of guilt and confusion. She knew what they had just done was wrong, but a part of her didn't regret it. She had been lonely for so long, and Ethan made her feel desirable again. But the guilt gnawed at her. What had she done? Was this just a fleeting lapse in judgment, or had she crossed an irreversible line? In the days that followed their intimate encounter, Evelyn and Ethan continued their affair in secret. Each stolen kiss, every touch, made Evelyn feel both alive and guilty. She couldn't stop thinking about him, and it seemed that he had the same effect on her. They began sneaking around, meeting in private, their relationship growing more intense with each passing day. Evelyn found herself becoming consumed by him, her thoughts dominated by their affair. But as time went on, the consequences of their actions began to materialize. Evelyn's children, who had been visiting her more often, started to notice her changed behavior. She was more distant, distracted. Her once neat house began to fall into disarray as she spent more time with Ethan. She neglected her gardening, and her hobbies no longer brought her joy. The only thing that mattered was the time she spent with him. One evening, while walking down the street with Ethan, Evelyn saw her daughter Karen pulling into the driveway. The sight of Karen stopped her in her tracks. Her daughter's narrowed gaze met Ethan, and Evelyn's heart sank. The confrontation came the next day. Karen had been silent throughout their walk, but once they entered the house, she finally spoke. "Mom," she said, her voice tight, "what's going on between you and Ethan?" Evelyn's heart raced. She had hoped to keep her affair a secret, but now the truth was starting to surface. She tried to deflect, but Karen's eyes were sharp. "I've seen the way he looks at you, Mom, and I've seen how you look at him." Evelyn's guilt overwhelmed her, hitting her with full force. She knew her daughter was right. She had been acting differently, and Karen had noticed. "It's not what you think," Evelyn said weakly, but even she knew it wasn't the truth. "Mom," Karen said, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You're in your 60s, and he's in his 30s. This isn't just harmless fun. This is wrong." Her words struck Evelyn like a punch to the stomach. Evelyn sat down, her hands trembling as she searched for the right words. The gravity of the situation was almost unbearable, and yet, part of her didn't want to face the truth. The affair with Michael wasn't just an indulgence. It had become a lifeline. But as Karen's face filled with worry and disappointment, Evelyn realized her daughter wasn't going to let her dismiss this easily. "I'm not a child, Karen," Evelyn replied, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't expect this to happen, but I'm lonely. You don't understand. Michael makes me feel alive again. I haven't felt like this in years. I know it's complicated, but it's not as simple as you think." Karen crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "I understand you're lonely, but there are other ways to cope. This affair is reckless. Think about your reputation, Mom. Think about what this will do to our family, what people will say." Evelyn's heart sank as she realized her actions had consequences far beyond her own emotions. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the damage she might be causing to the family she had spent her life building. The tension in the room was thick, and Evelyn knew Karen was right. She had acted impulsively, swept up in the excitement and passion of the affair. She knew it was wrong, but the deeper truth was that she hadn't felt valued, desired, or seen in so long. Michael had become a source of validation, even though their relationship was based on secrecy and lies. "I'm sorry," Evelyn finally said, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to hurt you or anyone else. I got lost in something I thought I needed." Karen's face softened, but there was still hurt in her eyes. "You don't need him, Mom. You need to find yourself again. You deserve better than this." The confrontation with Karen left Evelyn feeling shattered. She spent the next few days in a fog, questioning every choice she had made. The thrill and excitement of the affair had faded, replaced by guilt, shame, and confusion. Michael tried reaching out, calling and texting, but Evelyn couldn't bring herself to respond. The weight of the affair was becoming too much, and the consequences were crashing down on her like a tidal wave. Evelyn's world began to fall apart. Her once peaceful home now felt like a prison. She avoided her neighbors, afraid of their judgment if they found out. Her children began pulling away, unsure of how to handle the situation. Her relationship with Karen was strained, and Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she had betrayed the trust of everyone who cared about her. Soon after, Michael showed up at her door, his face filled with concern but also frustration. "Evelyn, what's going on?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. "We can't just end this. I've never felt this way about anyone before." Evelyn felt a pang in her chest. She had known Michael was attached to her, but hearing him express his feelings made everything even more complicated. "I can't keep doing this," she replied, her voice barely audible. "I can't keep living this lie. It's not just about us anymore. It's about my family, my children. I've ruined everything." Michael stepped closer, his hand gently brushing hers. "I care about you, Evelyn. I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice full of emotion. But Evelyn knew deep down that she couldn't continue. She had to end the affair, no matter how difficult. The consequences had already started to tear apart her life, and she wasn't sure if she could ever fix the damage. "I'm sorry, Michael," she said quietly. She murmured, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "We can't keep doing this." The days after her breakup with Ethan were filled with sorrow and regret. Evelyn had ended things with him, but the emptiness that followed felt almost worse than the affair itself. She couldn't ignore the ache of losing him, yet there was also a sense of relief. She had made the right decision for her family, though the cost had been steep. Her relationship with Emily remained strained. Emily didn't fully comprehend, but she was willing to try to move beyond it. Still, Evelyn knew it would take time for things to heal. Her children were disappointed in her, and the community she had once belonged to seemed to view her with judgment and sympathy. However, Evelyn also understood that this was the beginning of her journey to rediscover herself. The affair had shown her that she needed to seek fulfillment within, not through someone else. It had awakened a part of her that she had long neglected, but also revealed the depth of her loneliness and desire for connection. Over the next several months, Evelyn focused on rebuilding her life. She rekindled old friendships, reconnected with her children, and rediscovered her love for gardening and reading. Gradually, she began to heal, though the scars from the affair would always linger. She had learned difficult lessons about herself, loneliness, and the consequences of seeking validation in the wrong places. As time went on, Evelyn began to confront the full impact of the affair. Her brief relationship with Ethan had altered her in ways she hadn't anticipated. It had opened her eyes to the deep emptiness she had been avoiding for so long, but it had also caused a rift in her family that was hard to mend. Her children started to trust her again, but the bond they once shared was never entirely the same. Emily, though understanding, struggled to look at her mother without remembering the pain and betrayal she had endured. Evelyn knew she needed to rebuild that trust, but she also recognized it would take time. Evelyn also had to face the judgment of her community. The rumors were unavoidable, and while no one ever directly addressed her, she could sense the whispers behind her back. She had lived a quiet life, But now she bore the stigma of an affair that defied social norms. Instead of retreating, Evelyn began to hold her head high. She had made mistakes, but she was also striving to learn from them. The affair with Ethan was over, but the journey of self-discovery was just beginning. It was a calm evening when Evelyn sat on her porch, watching the sunset. She had finally come to terms with everything: the affair, the heartbreak, the consequences. Everything had changed her, but it had also given her a chance to rebuild. She had learned to forgive herself for the mistakes she had made and had come to realize that she didn't need anyone else to validate her worth. She had spent so many years seeking fulfillment from external sources, her husband, her children, and then Ethan, that she had forgotten how to find happiness within herself. But now she was learning to embrace her own company, to find joy in the simple things that once brought her peace. Evelyn didn't regret her affair with Ethan, but she knew it was a chapter she had to close. It was a painful reminder of her vulnerabilities and her longing for connection, but it had also served as a wake-up call. She was no longer defined by her past mistakes. She was free to live the rest of her life on her own terms, knowing that, in the end, the most important relationship she could nurture was the one she had with herself. As the sun dipped below the horizon on another quiet evening, Evelyn smiled, hopeful for the future. She had found the strength to move forward, and that in itself was a victory.